Good afternoon. It's X Winterview, back again with another brief dialogue. For who? For his dear friend, Annastacey. The last brief dialogue I gave talked a little bit about the mechanics of duality, a subject that I quite enjoy talking about. So much so that I thought I would continue on a little bit further with the mechanics of duality. So, to give a brief recap on the last episode, where we left our hero, that's me, talking about the mechanics of duality. We have a few things in play. We have the mind's poor ability to perceive spectrum, or a dislike for it, frankly. It would rather think in discrete objects. The mind turns things that are more spectral into discrete objects, and then decides that these objects have some kind of independent reality or validity. In the human domain, the objects that it takes on for itself are the ones it likes, usually good things like honesty, truth, nobility, wealth, intelligence, charisma, friendliness, blah blah blah, all that stuff, and throws out all the nasty negative stuff, the dark side, onto the apparent world out there, especially the enemies. They are not noble, they are mean, they are nasty, they are liars, they are cheats, they are bad people, and so on and so forth. In a sort of endless game, endless fascination. So this particular dialogue is, again, getting out the microscope and looking at another part of this mechanics of duality. I get asked this question quite a lot. I mean, it comes up clinically, you could say, quite a lot, and in these types of dialogues with friends and family who happen to be a little bit interested. So I'll talk a little bit about it in this brief dialogue here. Earlier it was mentioned that the mind is very poor at seeing spectrum, perceiving spectrum, and prefers to objectify, to cluster or clump parts of the spectrum. But there's another side to it as well, and I said the word prefers as if the mind has some preference, but the preferences really, in essence, relate to beliefs as well, very strongly to belief systems. And belief systems, to recap that, are cognitive narratives about how the world makes sense, why the world makes sense. It's a story about the world and how it works, in essence. And in psychology we call it sense-making. So a belief is a sense-making about the world. And it's difficult to disentangle. Once you have a belief, you tend to see evidence for the belief everywhere. And once you see evidence for it, it reinforces the belief. So it's a sort of chicken-egg scenario where there's no clear-cut answer. Do I really see the bad people over there because I believe they're bad? Or actually are they bad, which makes me believe that they're bad? And so on and so forth. So I thought we'd take a little stroll down the mechanics of how the mind filters and partials out stuff in a particular way. And to start with, I'm going to look at the example of anger. It's a really easy, I think, example to explore. Now, let's go back to the original model. This model that there's a spectrum that the mind struggles to see. And I used in my previous dialogue the example of peace. There's a spectrum of peace. In this example, I'm going to use love. Now, we hear in spiritual talks or books and stuff that the essence is love. Everything's about love. Yet, when we look around the world, we don't see it. Or we see it a little bit, occasionally, and it's very personal. It's my partner, my wife, my girlfriend, my boyfriend loves me, therefore I see love sometimes. I love pizza. Yeah, I love stuff. I love good, nice clothes. I love a good movie, but not in all that sort of stuff. But this whole idea that everything is love, the world is love, 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 it's very puzzling to the mind, who just doesn't see it. So let's have a look at that as the spectrum. Imagine then that the world is love, like the entire manifestation is just as one giant love-in, and we somehow aren't seeing it. Why aren't we seeing it, is the question. So we go back to the spectrum. Love can be looked at as maybe an infinite spectrum of love. I don't know if it's infinite. Can't imagine the upper levels of that. And what would the lower levels look like? We're sort of talking about heaven and hell suddenly, aren't we? Heaven being obviously the loving, doving part of the whole thing, and hell being the not so nice part. But perhaps it's a spectrum. And perhaps we see heaven or we see hell, or perceive heaven and perceive hell, based on the filtering system, you could say, of mind. I wonder if that's the case. So let's have a look and see what happens. We said earlier that, well, I said at least, earlier that the mind doesn't think spectrumally very well. It likes to chunk and group things on the spectrum into discrete entities. And it ends up inevitably making polar opposites of whatever it conceptualizes. So in order to conceptualize a thing, it has to have an opposite too. Now, why does it have to have an opposite? Because it helps define the thing. Whatever is not the thing makes the thing more the thing. Does that make sense? That sounds a bit crazy. Let's take an example. I'm going to take the example of a dog. Try and keep these examples real simple. If I define a dog, then everything that is not dog, you could say, helps define the dog. Now, I wouldn't say things are opposite to the dog, but that's just we'll see how that comes in a little bit. So if I see a cat, I'm like, not dog. If I see a cow, not dog. If I see a car, not dog. If I see a building, not dog. All these nots also help to define the isness of that dog. Okay, so that's a bit of a crazy example. Let's go back to the human stuff, where people tend to like the human stuff a bit more. Let's choose let's pull out a belief. Now, the belief is again, remember, it's a sense-making cognitive framework. God, I'm getting real tech today. It's a sense-making cognitive framework. It's a way of making the world make sense. Now, it's important to mention too in this dialogue that making the world make sense requires a sense-making of yourself at the same time. Why is that? Because here's the duality. If there's a world, there's a me. There has to be a me if there's a world. Why is that? Because if there's a world, then there must be someone to see that world, is the rationale the mind gives. You could look at it the other way. If there's a me, then there must be a not me. And the not me is the world around the me. Does that make sense? That's a core understanding there of how the duality plays out. Now, if there's a world and therefore there's a me, then the two are sort of linked inextricably. And now we look at the type of me that exists in the world. The sense-making starts to kick in. What am I? Who am I? What type of person am I? What type of world do I live in? And so on and so forth. I'm the type of person who does the right thing. There we go. I have this idea that the way I live is the correct way to live. It's a good way to live. One small glitch, you might say, and that is, as I define myself with all these wonderful characteristics, wonderful traits, I have to simultaneously be defining the opposite. Because in order to give validation and reality to these positive characteristics, there needs to simultaneously be a sense of what I'm not. I'm not a bastard. I'm not disingenuous. I'm not a liar. I'm not a cheat. I'm not a thief, and so on and so forth. And therefore, in order to have that sense, I need to be able to point to all that stuff somewhere. And where does it exist? Where do these characteristics that I don't like, that I disown, where do they live? They live, of course, outside of me. They're not in me. I don't have those. I'm a good person. And so to do it really easily, I just point to things and go, look, that person is bad, therefore I'm good. Now if we go back to the example of somehow being right, my way of life is right, then I have to be able to point to someone whose way of life is wrong. Isn't that interesting? Let's use environmentalism as a great example of this. I'm a good person because I recycle. I'm conscientious about my carbon footprint. I wear organic, locally sourced, renewable hemp cloth because that makes me an environmentally conscientious person, which in turn makes me a good person. But my neighbour is a bad person. My neighbour does not recycle. My neighbour wears disgusting polyester artificial fabric that are made in sweatshops in China by 10-year-olds. My neighbour leaves a whopping great carbon footprint because they drive a huge SUV that gets 50 litres or 50 gallons, if you like, to the meter. Terrible fuel efficiency in their car, whereas I drive a Prius. You see? So there I am, defining myself as I define my neighbour, equally as I define my neighbour. Well, the more I define my neighbour, you could say the other way around, is the more I define who I am and what I am. And I need to engage all the behaviours that of a good environmentalist in order to further define myself. Now here's where it gets particularly interesting, I think. Particularly interesting. The neighbour, therefore, is wrong in some way, and I, therefore, am right in some way. Now this relates, the ability to see the right and wrongness perceives directly to the fragility, you could say, or strength if you prefer, of the self-concept. The more insecure the self-concept, the more evidence it needs, you could say, to bolster itself, you could say, the less sophistication around the thinking of the self and others, you could say, leads to a more polar acting out of the right and the wrong in order to reinforce and stabilize my emotional system, my self-concept, which in turn stabilizes my emotional system, sense of belonging, sense of righteousness, and all that. So this little sub-mechanic, the stability, starts to explain how right versus wrong emerges in thinking. Right versus wrong. The right versus wrong polarity has a very particular emotional correlate, and that is anger. right versus wrong. If you're into the right versus wrong thing, you might say, it suggests an instability around some kind of self-concept that you've got going, and a tendency therefore to polarize outwardly or project outwardly all the negative stuff, and then, this is the great part, fight against it. Fighting against the perceived negativity out there. So what I need to do is I need to join an environmental organization that is quite radical, and we actually fight. We actually blow shit up. And the more I can do that, the more I can fight against let's go another way. The less that I own this anger, the more distance I want to create from this anger, the more I need to fight my enemy somewhere out there. I need to blow up Japanese whaling ships. That's what I need to do. I need to sabotage the workers in the Amazon by, blowing up their tractors and all that. Because I'm angry about it. I'm angry about what's happening in the world. And the reason I'm angry is because there are people in the world who are not doing what I think they should do. They are not being good humans. They are not being environmentally aware. And I will show the world and myself how environmentally aware I am by acting out this anger drama. That's what I'll do. That's what I'll do. Now I could go on and on with lots of different examples of how this plays out. It's a little bit tricky to grasp, I guess. And I'm not sure if I did a great job of explaining that. So let's try and summarize, put it all together. The mind doesn't handle spectrum very well. It tends to reify or objectify parts of the spectrum into a this and a that. The fundamental duality, you could say, is me. If there's a me, there's a world. If there's a world, there's a me. The next part is, it's not good enough just to have a me. This me needs stability. I need to have a good me. My fundamental directive as a me is to be a good me, to live a life that is good somehow. I actually don't know what good is, so what I need to do is figure out good, and I do that by choosing things for whatever reason that I think are good, that I've got reward for in the past, something that I found rewarding for some reason. Some people maybe patted me on the back, and this becomes the core of my self-concept. And I need to define my self-concept by owning the things that I like about myself and projecting out the things I don't like. And a way I can do this even more stringently or more aggressively is to actually fight things out in the world to further reinforce that which I am. A particular duality that I used in this example was the idea of right versus wrong. Right versus wrong is one of the core drivers of the emotion of anger. And the anger, I guess, is an emotion that is for some people very difficult to own. Very difficult to own. I can't own my anger. I need to project it out onto the cause of my anger, and that is the people who are doing it wrong. But I'm more likely to do that if my self-concept is fragile, if I'm unwilling to own lots of stuff about me. If I can't be reasonable and benign about my good and bad points, then I'm more likely to project it out there. And so in order to further stabilize my self-concept, I end up fighting enemies out there in the world to further support the ideas that I have about my own righteousness. Okay, think I did a more or less okay kind of job on that. Probably needs a bit more finessing of that model. This was off the cuff though, unplanned, unprepared, only had one coffee today. Caveat. Thanks again for listening, always a pleasure. As usual, comments are very welcome. Ideas. This makes me feel good. This gives me self-esteem. This gives me comfort. Now,